Chapter 186. Summer, 1995. Grant. Mr. Chapman, we are very pleased to extend the following offer of employment to you on behalf of Brighton and Hove City Council. Social Worker, Child and Youth Welfare. Please see the attached brochure for details on your salary and working hours. You have 30 days to respond to this offer, by either post or telephone. We look forward to hearing from you. A.P. Green, Head of Social Services, Brighton and Hove. Grant read the letter 3 times, just to make sure. Well, he really ought to be happy, thrilled. This was amazing news, news worth celebrating. It was one way out of the mess he currently found himself in anyway. He shook his head, feeling terrible for thinking Remus's life was a mess, even if it was a little bit true. He had gone down for the interview a few weeks ago, telling Remus he was working late. Not that he wanted to hide anything from Remus, more like he just didn't want to jinx things. Grant wasn't a very lucky person generally. Stuff like this never ever happened to him. Grant didn't believe in God or guardian angels or Buddha or anything other than his own willpower, but something about this job offer smacked of divine intervention. This was his dream job after all. Perhaps this was the sign he was waiting for, as if old ex-boyfriends returning from prison wasn't enough of an omen. He'd been toying with the idea of moving for years. Grant loved London. It would always be in his blood. But they were both in their mid-30s now, and maybe it was time for a change. He wanted to get Remus out to the countryside, to fresh air and sea and space, a fresh start away from their miserable little flat. So when the position came up, and Grant's manager mentioned it to him, he leapt at the chance. Of course, that was all before Sirius came back. Grant reread the letter again from the top. He stared at his name in official black and white printed text. A letter with my name on it, and it's not even a court summons, he joked to himself. He wished he could show his dickhead grandfather, show him what Nancy boy delinquents can amount to when they put their minds to it. He was proud of himself, and no matter what the situation was right now, he knew Remus would be proud of him too. He wished he could tell him straight away, but Remus was out, and Grant was hiding in the bedroom from Sirius. Grant was supposed to be keeping an eye on him. He'd promised, but as soon as Remus was out the door, Sirius had said something nasty about not needing a nursemaid. Bloody hell, how posh was he? And turned into a dog again. It was so painfully obvious that Black hated Grant's guts, so hiding out in the bedroom felt like the best solution. He'd have to wait for Remus to get home then, to break the news. He hoped it wouldn't be too long, but he had no idea really. Remus had gone to some sort of meeting and hadn't given Grant any details. He'd talked to Sirius about it though, at length. They muttered together in the living room, thinking Grant wouldn't notice. The pitch of their whispering swung wildly to and fro, one moment angry staccato hissing, the next soothing low apologies. Their body language was the same. Grant learnt quickly that the important stuff between Sirius and Remus was the stuff neither of them said out loud. It was all in looks, gestures, tilted heads and raised eyebrows, impossible for an outsider to keep up with, and Grant felt very much the outsider. He had never known two people could be simultaneously so angry with each other and so much in love. And it was love, without a doubt. Grant got a sick feeling in his stomach. He'd been ignoring it for days. Remus had been different for a while, but until that bloody black dog showed up, Grant had thought there might be hope for recovery. A bit more time, a bit of space, some distance from all that darkness. Grant would pull Remus back from the edge. He'd done it before, he could do it again. But now it looked impossible. Remus did not want things back the way they were. He hadn't said it, maybe he didn't know it, but it was very obvious to Grant. Look, okay, Grant knew he was not the brightest bulb in the box. Not as clever as Remus anyway. Probably not as clever as Sirius. That had never bothered him much, because after all, he couldn't be anyone but himself, and he had plenty else going for him. He worked hard, and he cared about people, and people cared about him, and those things were ingredients for a very happy life, in Grant's opinion. So, he wasn't a genius, but he did know some things. He liked to think that at the very least, he knew when it was time to make a graceful exit. Grant loved Remus very much. He'd probably loved him ever since that first day 20 years ago when the lanky, exhausted, skittish teenager had loped into the dorm room at St. Edmund's. He was so quiet and so closed up, even though there was clearly a universe inside of him. Remus was never the same person twice. He was jaded and world-weary one moment, naive and blushing the next. He was bubbling with rage and love at the same time, and most of the time he let love win. Grant liked to think he'd had a bit of a hand in that, especially over the past few years. Grant had worked hard to keep the softest parts of Remus safe. And he had. He'd done a good job. He'd taken care of him, until Remus didn't really need taking care of anymore. It was perhaps time to let go. He still just didn't want to hand him back like a borrowed book. Grant had said goodbye to plenty of people over the course of his short yet colourful life, and not one of them had meant a thing, until Remus. Grant knew how pathetic that sounded. Nearing 36, and only one real relationship, only one true friendship. Whatever happened, they would stay friends, there was no question of that. But Grant knew he had to be practical, and he had to look after himself, for once. Remus had always belonged to another world. That was partly what made him so attractive. The time had come for Remus to go back where he belonged, and though Grant knew that for a while the absent would hurt, it was completely necessary. It reminded him of that Suzanne Vega song. Grant was never one for reading too much into lyrics, not like Remus. He didn't have a poetic soul. But when the Solitude Standing album came out, it had been all over the radio, and Grant quite liked it. He always meant to buy the album, but never got around to it. She had a haunting voice, and this one particular tune was ghostly and strange. Then Remus had told him what it was about, and he hated it. He didn't usually like fairy tales, having recognised his sexuality at the age of 6, and the idea of brave knights rescuing damsels in distress had never inspired him much. But something about Calypso really struck a nerve. He knew he wasn't a siren, sitting on the rocks, jiggling his tits at passing sailors. But he knew Remus. He knew Remus inside out. He had seen the change in him since Sirius came back. At first, Remus had clung to Grant as his protector, which made sense. A bit of regression was probably to be expected, and Grant had always done his best to be solid ground for Remus. But after the stress of the first few days had passed, Remus and Sirius had both relaxed a little bit, and everything was different. So different it was shocking. Grant hadn't really known what their relationship was like when they were young, but he caught glimpses of it now. The way Remus stared at Sirius, as if he was the most gorgeous creature on earth, the heat in his eyes, the way his tongue played in the corner of his mouth, like he was daydreaming something utterly filthy. Remus had never looked at Grant like that. Not really. And Sirius lit up when Remus spoke to him. Yeah, they were obviously still in love, and it wasn't the same kind of love Grant and Remus had. He didn't know if it was better or not, but he could practically feel the conflict tearing Remus apart. He didn't want to tear Remus apart, he never had. He still wanted to keep him safe. And there was Sirius himself, prim and poisonous, lurking like a spider all the time, glaring daggers whenever Grant entered the room. He made his feelings perfectly clear, and it made Grant indignant, made him want to fight harder to keep Remus. But that wasn't up to Grant anymore. Remus was going somewhere Grant couldn't follow him. They'd reached a crossroads, and it was all very clear. Maybe the letter really was an omen. He conjured up the image he'd been toying with, of him and Remus in a house by the sea, reading books and eating breakfast in bed, and going for walks into town. Getting older, making new friends. If they had a big enough house, they could begin fostering. Grant had been interested in doing that for years. He wanted to take care of kids no one else wanted. And if he was going to be a social worker, then he'd be a perfect candidate. He let the fantasy wash over him one last time, and then he began to dismantle it. Because deep down Grant knew that Remus would never have left London anyway, and Remus would never want to foster children. He'd be too afraid he'd hurt them on a full moon. That future had always been a bit of a wishful thinking. It was more about Grant than Remus. It was time to stop worrying about Remus and what Remus needed. That wasn't his responsibility anymore. Perhaps there would be someone else for Grant. He hoped so. He would never stop looking. Perhaps someone would want to keep him safe for a change. Stranger things happened at sea. The decision was made. Grant wrote a formal response accepting the job offer. He'd post it on his way out. He began to pack quietly, hoping that Remus wouldn't come home until he was finished. There was so much to do, but at the same time not a lot. Grant found himself surprised by just how easily the plan came together. He had his own bank account, and he didn't have any stake in the flat. He could stay at his aunt's pub down in Hove until he found his own place to live. He even had friends in Brighton, from when he'd lived there as a kid. So once he'd packed, he just needed to say goodbye. He hoped he could say it the right way, and not sound bitter or self-pitying. He hoped Remus would understand that Grant would always be there if he needed him. He'd come running in a heartbeat. At the same time, he hoped that Remus would not need him. He hoped that he was leaving him in safe hands. Finished packing, Grant sat on the bed. He could hear the TV on in the other room, up a bit too loud. Sirius left it on all night sometimes, and it woke Grant up. But if he went through to turn it off, that hideous black dog would wake up and start growling at him in the dark. Probably a trauma thing. Grant didn't blame Sirius, but he wished it didn't have to manifest like that. Could he really trust a man like that to take care of anyone? Grant's heart ached as he imagined Remus, sweet, serious, sensitive Remus, being treated like a mental punching bag. He would just put up with it, Grant could tell. Remus felt so guilty about Sirius's imprisonment that he was willing to take all sorts of abuse for it. But that wasn't right. Grant stood up. He had to do one more thing then, before he could leave. He had to talk to Sirius. End of chapter 186.